Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of GDDV 106 Development Concepts. My name is Kasanas. Well guys, we are moving into what would be week 5. Week 5 if you were actually sitting in my classroom. I don't know how many videos we've got. We've got a ton, but this would be week 5. We're moving along pretty darn well in this particular course. We've already covered the course intro and done an introduction to Unity. We've talked briefly about scripting in C#. We discussed logic and control, and we did an introduction to UI. With this week, what I'd like to take a look at is physics, and we're going to start off with a really basic introduction to physics, both 2D and 3D. All right, let's get started. So physics settings, and in fact, we're going to look at a number of different things before we immediately dive into the physics components. There's a number of things that I want to take a look at first. Several things that we haven't discussed at all that are actually going to be important in order for us to be able to explore the physics engines and the physics components. So there's a couple of things that we're going to have to branch off to before we get right into physics. And it's really important to note, I'm talking about physics here, and this is going to be a very brief introduction to physics. That's all we're going to do. We're going to take a look at the physics engine and the physics engines, because there's two of them, a 2D and a 3D physics engine. We're going to take a look at those physics engines, and we're going to look at a handful of components only. And the reason why is a couple of these components are extremely important regardless of the type of game you're making. You'll use these components for almost any game you ever create. So I think it's important that we kind of examine physics, at least on the surface, in this particular course. There is, if you're actually going to Centennial and you're in the game development program, there is an entire course that is dedicated to the study of Unity's physics engines. And that is our games physics course. And that is available in your second semester of your first year. So you're gonna deeply explore the physics engines in this first year, but now just gonna do an introduction, okay? And a couple things to note as well. We'll mostly cover the idea of the 2D physics engine, but realize that as we talk about the 2D physics components, that there is probably an equivalent 3D physics component as well. You know, there's some differences in the two, but that if we only talk about the 2D physics side of things, that there's probably something that's the same in the 3D side. It's also really important to note that the 2D and 3D physics engines are completely separate engines, and that means that the two engines do not interact in any way. So if you've got yourself 2D physics components and you're trying to have it act with a 3D physics component, it just won't work. They ignore each other entirely. And vice versa. If you've got 3D physics components and you want it to interact with a 2D physics component, it's just not going to work. All right. So it's really important to note that. So there are two very separate engines, and for that reason, they have two very separate project settings as far as the physics are concerned. If you want to go ahead and take a look at your Unity physics engine properties, project settings, you can do it under Edit, Project Settings, Physics for the 3D engine, and Edit, Project Settings, Physics 2D for the 2D physics engine settings. So let's move on to physics, or we're going to in a minute, actually. Before we can move on to physics, I want to take a look at sprites. And we haven't really explored the idea of adding a visual element into your game scene. We've talked about adding UI elements and allowing the users to visually see the HUD, but we haven't talked about actually adding visual elements into the scene itself. And I think we're going to look at that right now through the use of sprites. So we're going to explore the 2D side of things, the 2D physics side of things. And I want to talk about sprites now just so that we have a visual component. You can see exactly what's occurring within the scene. That's the only reason we're doing that right now. They're really, really easy, and we'll just do it really quickly here. So a sprite can be added to your scene through game object, 2D object, sprite. And you'll have a number of different choices there, and we'll take a look at that actually in the engine in just a moment. Or alternatively, you can add a sprite to your scene by simply dragging and dropping the sprite asset either into the hierarchy or into the scene view. As soon as you do so, the sprite will be added appropriately. You'll see it within the scene view, and it'll appear within the hierarchy, regardless of where you've dropped it off. Sprites themselves add that visual component, and they're obviously used in almost every single game. So when we start talking about sprites, they're exactly the same as any other game object. They've got themselves a transform node, which again allows you to manipulate the position, the rotation, and the scale. It's also got something called a sprite renderer, and this is really the meat of what makes this a sprite. The sprite renderer allows you to edit visual settings of the sprite itself. It allows you to flip it back and forth as far as the X or Y axes are concerned. It allows you in 2D to define the sorting layer, and the sorting layer tells you what is rendered on top of what. Any of the lower numbers are rendered first and higher numbers are rendered second. And what this does, by having this sorting layer available to us, it ensures that our sprites are rendered in the order that we want them to. If all the sprites were on the same sorting layer, they would all be piled on top of each other, and we get what's called Z fighting occurring. And that's kind of this flickering that we'll see within objects if they're on top of each other. If you've properly set your sorting order, then Unity understands when to render what's on top of what, and everything will be rendered perfectly well. Instead of talking about this, let's head into Unity right now, and we'll take a look at the physics settings, and we'll take a look at sprite objects. All right, let's get into Unity. Okay guys, here we are inside of Unity, and all I've done is added a brand new scene, week 5, to our previous Dev Concepts project. If you're actually in my course, I'm going to make sure you guys have this project. If you're taking this course at Centennial, I'll make sure you guys have this project so you can play around with it as we are going through the slides as well. So I haven't done anything yet. Let's take a look at, first of all, let's take a look at the physics options. If you go over to Edit, and you go down to Project Settings. Under Project Settings, it'll launch this brand new window. And we have a number of different settings that are available for your project here. That's what this is all about. If we take a look, we've got ourselves physics and we have ourselves physics 2D. And like I said previously, these are two separate, entirely separate engines and therefore have entirely separate settings. And even if you take a look, the physics, which is for 3D, is different than that of the options for physics 2D. They both at the top have gravity. So let's just take a look at gravity, and this will show us how different these engines are. Right now, gravity is in 3D space is based on a three-dimensional area with X, Y, and Z. So we have a vector 3 here, X, Y, and Z values. Currently, X is set to 0, Y is set to negative 9.81, and negative 9.81 meters per second is the acceleration of gravity. As the force of gravity there. And we've got ourselves Z equal to 0. Under physics 2D, we have only a vector 2 with an X and a Y value. And in this particular case, the Y value is exactly the same for both engines. It doesn't have to be, though. And you don't only have to have gravity working downwards as well. If you want to set your gravity to an entirely different direction, you absolutely can. So let's say I want to make positive gravity. Well, I can. And you'll note that if I go back to the physics engine, it did not in any way change. When I changed the physics 2D engine settings, it didn't in any way change the physics engine settings. So they're completely and utterly separate, right? And you don't only have to have it work in the Y. Obviously, you can have your gravity work in any direction you wanted. It can go in any direction you want. If you wanted to, pull something across your screen, have it fall across your screen instead of downwards, well, then you could absolutely put in a value for the X setting as opposed to the Y setting. All right, so these are your physics settings in here. There's a bunch of stuff in here. Play around with it, guys. I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a lot here. And like I said, this is just a brief introduction to physics. So the next thing I want to talk about is the idea of sprites. And I've added a handful of new sprites here. And there's a couple things that I kind of want to explore when it comes to sprites. So let's take a look at a number of different things. First of all, if I click and I drag these elements, I can either drop it directly into the scene, or I can drop it directly into my hierarchy. And there's only one real difference between these two things. If I drop it in my hierarchy, you'll see that my face here appears at the origin, position equals 0, 0, 0. If I drag and drop this element into the scene like this, instead it'll appear at wherever I've positioned it, so negative 5 and almost 0. All right, so wherever you've dropped it within your scene, it's going to appear. If you drag it into the hierarchy, it appears at the origin. That's the only real difference right there. And you can see otherwise it's exactly the same. So both of these options created the game object, and the game object is exactly the same. So my zombie or my face is exactly the same as far as what's included. The other way of creating yourself a sprite is to go to game object, head down to Object 2D and choose the option of Sprite. And the Sprite renderer has nothing as far as the sprite is concerned. If I take a look at this one here, well, the PNG that I dragged in goes into the role, the variable of Sprite. But this new sprite has nothing associated with it. And I can associate something. Let's say I go over to this little dot here and I click, well, I can choose this other face and add it in. Now, if we take a look, this is something else that's really important to note. If this happens to you guys, don't panic. So right now I can see it here, but it's not appearing down here. And I'm not sure if anyone knows why, and I'm not sure if we even talked about the idea of the Unity camera yet. But right now our Unity camera in 3D, if I take a look, if I go to my camera, our face there is falling on the wrong side of the camera. Only things within this area are going to be rendered. There's so much to cover in these courses. So this is called the frustrum of the camera. Just so you guys know, this is the frustrum. If you are falling outside, it's probably because your object is outside of that frustrum. So if I take a look at this new sprite, it's not actually showing up down here at all, and that's because it's falling outside of the frustrum, which you can't see if you're working in 2D space. So just make sure that you've got your images all falling within the frustrum. If I take a look now, I'm within the frustrum of that camera. So now I'm seeing everything. Okay. All right, so just something very brief to show you. Let's go back to 2D space here. Okay, so right now we've got ourselves several different sprites that I've created in several different ways, dragging in the hierarchy, dragging on the scene, or through the menu itself. But they're all identical in nature. If I click on this one here, for example, I've got a transform node and I've got a sprite renderer. The transform node works like it would for any other object that we ever build within here. Okay, it's going to allow us to change the position, the rotation, the scale through the use of the tools that we've got up here, right? I can drag this guy around as much as I want, and it's going to affect the transform node. Everything has a transform node. Everything allows you to position it within space, within the game space. The more important thing here, the more important component, well, I guess maybe not important, but what actually makes this into a sprite is the sprite renderer. And the sprite renderer has a number of different options, and we'll go over a couple of those right now. So the sprite itself is the associated image. We already saw that, where I could set up an image of some kind and it would automatically show on the screen because I filled in this particular variable. So that's all that is. And you can swap it out using that little dot if you want to. Below that is our color, and this is going to allow us to change the actual color of the sprite itself. So if I want to add a tint, I absolutely can. Drag this around. There we go. Got ourselves a red one. And that's very similar to what we saw previously, right? When we took a look at the UI elements, the image elements, we had the ability to adjust the color of that as well. Kind of the same thing here. Below that, we've got ourselves our flip options, and it's important to note that these flip options are only flipping the actual image itself, the actual sprite itself. It's not flipping the game object in any way, only this visual element. So let's say I flip it in the Y. You can see I'm flipping up and down. If I flip it in the X, no. If I flip it in the X, then I'm flipping back and forth across that the X across the X. That's all it does, though. You'll note as I flip it, it doesn't in any way change the rotation of the transform. Nothing's happened to the transform itself. It is only flipping the image. So that's really important to take note of. Draw mode, lots of stuff we don't have to worry about. The draw mode is very similar to that of the UI elements. In this case here, we only have three options: simple, sliced, and tiled. The fill options that we had within the UI elements are not there. What's really important, however, is this sorting layer, and this is where a lot of people run into problems. The sorting layer itself is the sorting layer and the ordering layer is what is going to allow us to ensure that we don't have what's called Z fighting. You'll note that the sorting layer is default and the ordering layer is default for this particular sprite. If I check this one out, well, the same thing is true. If I check this one out, the same thing is true. And that's where we end up with a problem with Z fighting. If the ordering layer is the same, we can have what's called Z fighting. And that is when we get this flickering that occurs, really rapid flickering that occurs as the renderer tries to put both of these things in the same location at the same time. Adjusting the ordering layer is going to allow you to ensure that your rendering is done properly. The things with a lower number are rendered first, and things with a higher number will be rendered on top. So if I adjust, for example, let's say I wanted this guy in the very back, well, I can put the ordering layer to, let's say, a negative value, let's say -5. And I want this guy in the front, well, I can change this ordering layer to 10. Now, every time that we hit play, the ordering layer 10 will be rendered on top of the ordering layer -5. Okay? If you have yourself a large project and you want to make sure that you don't have any Z fighting, it's really important to stay organized as far as your order layer and your sorting layers are concerned. Okay, you can have several different sorting layers that are available to you, and if you add in your custom sorting layers, then you can add ordering layers for those particular sorting layers as well, just to make sure that no Z fighting is occurring. Z fighting is extremely distracting when you're playing a game. If you see these things flickering back and forth, it's extremely distracting. And we don't want people to look at the production of our game. We just want them playing our game, right? So we want to move all these distractions. If you've got yourself a large game with a ton of different things in it that can overlap as far as 2D space is concerned, you're going to want to make sure that you keep a very careful list of your sorting layers and your ordering layers within those sorting layers. That'll just make sure that later on, as you add more and more elements, that you remain organized, right? And you'll avoid your Z fighting. Anyway, that is the sorting layer. So In each of the examples I've shown you so far, we've only had a single image. If we take a look down here, we've got ourselves our sprite itself, and we've got ourselves the actual image that's associated with that particular sprite. In some cases, you might have a compound element like this one right here. So let's say I was going to use this to build a spaceship. Again, it looks very similar in nature to these other ones where I've got my actual sprite and then here's the image associated with it. But this, in fact, is not a single image. I don't want it to be. I want it to be 3 distinct parts that I can pile on top to make a compound object. If I try and drag this on the scene, well, I can do so, but it comes in all as one part. It's still the player ship, and I can't select any of these individual bits, right? They're all together as one. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that our sprites, when we have multiple sprites within the same sheet, we're going to want to make sure that they can be separated somehow. And let's take a look at exactly how we're going to do that. Let me just close these off so it's cleaner, so it's not confusing. All right, let's take a look at exactly how we're going to do that. If I click on the sprite itself, in the inspector, I can see it pop up, and I can see all the information about that particular sprite over here. There's a number of different things here. This is going to be how large it is within your scene, so pixels per unit. Watch what happens. If I change, let's say I change this one here. If I change this one here, so I'm on this, the old Casanas here. If I change this value, let's say instead of 100 pixels per unit, I set it to 10. All right, and then I apply, because nothing's actually happened yet. Down here is an apply button, and I apply. It's going to change the size of this particular image as it's brought into your scene. Okay, by default, it has a value of 100. And I'll apply it again. By default, it has a value of 100, and that's going to make it come in looking like this. If you change your pixels per unit, it is definitely going to change the size of whatever it is you're bringing in. Okay. What I really want to show you, though, wasn't this stuff here. You can play around with all this stuff up here as well. What I really want to show you is this right here, our Sprite Editor. And each of these, each of the zombie, the old guy, and the me are all what's called a single sprite, all right? But this right here is a sprite sheet. I've got several different sprites associated with this player ship. I don't actually want the sprite mode to be single. I actually want it to be multiple. So if I come in here, I can click on the multiple option. And when I click on it, it's going to change a number of things. Right now, nothing's changed, right? Nothing's actually changed at this time. But when I go to the Sprite Editor in the option with the option set to sprite mode and I apply this, it's going to automatically launch this brand new window. And this brand new window is going to allow me to break up this into whatever it is I want to create. In this particular case, 3 different objects: this turret, this body, and this thruster. Okay, so that's what I want to break it up into. And we'll talk about this much more when we in the animation side of things later on. But for now, let's look at how we can do this. We can slice things right here. And the slice option has a number of different options for us. If we've got a grid, we have a whole bunch of images in here, let's say for an animation sprite sheet, well, we could utilize a grid. But if we stick with automatic right now, what it's going to do, it's going to look for the different elements, and it's going to try its best to slice these into the individual components. Okay, so if I say slice right now, it's really hard to see, but if I zoom in, you probably can't see it at all, to be honest. If I zoom in, though, if you're doing this at home, if you zoom in, you're going to see that there's now a line around each of these elements. And that line is sliced this into 3 separate parts, all right, 3 separate parts. Before it actually works, I have to hit apply. If I forget to hit apply and I close this off, it's going to say, whoa, don't forget to apply. And if I do so, what we'll see down here now inside of our project is that that single sprite has been divided into 3 distinct objects. I can now drag these 3 distinct objects into our scene. And I can use these 3 distinct objects to create exactly what it is I want to create. Now, let's take a look at what's happening here. In this particular case, my turret is in the back, my body is in the middle, and this thruster thing is in the front. Each of them have the same layer, order and layer, however, and they're all in the same sorting layer. They're all set to the value of 0. What I actually want to happen here, let's say I want to build this into some kind of like spaceship. I want to go in and I want to change these objects. So this one's on top. Well, I'm going to change the order and layer. Watch this. I'm going to drag it over here, and I can see it's behind, but I'm going to set this order and layer instead to a value of 1, and you can see how it automatically popped on top. All right, so let's say this is our turret, and let's say that I wanted the same thing to occur with this thruster, but I wanted it in the back instead. Well, I could change the order and layer to, let's say, -1, and now it's behind everything else. All right, and I can set this up so I've got myself my player spaceship. Now, a couple other things that we want to take note of. This is our, and we want to rename these, obviously. I'd want to rename this to, like, let's say, turret. All right, and this might be ship body. I don't know, ship body. And this could be our thruster. All right, our thruster. Doesn't really matter what we call it. All right, so I'm going to rename everything, and I can see what they are now. Let's say that I want to set these up so that the turret itself could rotate. Well, right now, if I take a look, let's just zoom in on this turret. If I take a look at this turret right now, the pivot point is right here in this position here. Let's say I was setting this up so it was going to be like a turret cannon. If I rotate it, look where it's rotating now. I don't like that, right? I don't want that. So I can go ahead and I can adjust where the pivot point is. And once again, that can be done right inside of your Sprite Editor. I'm going to click on this once again. I'm going to hit Sprite Editor. I'm going to come in here, and the pivot point is represented by this little circle right here. If I want to change that, I absolutely can. I can simply drag it around. Let's say that I think that, oh, here's the center of my actual turret. I can drag it to where I want it. I can hit the apply button, and when I head back into Unity now, we've got our turret. It's been adjusted so that the origin is back in the pivot's back in the original location. So everything's been shifted upwards, but I can move this back to where I want it. And now our cannon can now pivot around that new axis. All right. Okay. All right. So that's it. That is our sprites. Let's head back to the lecture and move on with physics. All right, guys, I am currently editing this video, and I am realizing that I went on for quite a long time. This video is well over an hour long, and I don't like to create content that is that long. I'd rather keep it short, 15 minutes to maybe 25 minutes at most, and that way you guys can consume it in little bite-sized pieces and absorb the information. So we're going to cut it off right here for the day. It's not where I wanted to cut it off, but we're going to cut it off right here for this particular episode at least. We will see the remainder of what I recorded in the next episode. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know down below with a thumbs up, and if not, a thumbs down is perfectly fine. I love to hear from you guys, so lots of comments, okay? Thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.